our next distinguished panelist and speaker, Mr. Khaled Sherif, who is the Vice President responsible for regional integration and business delivery at the African Development Bank. Mr. Sherif is indeed joining us to basically share with us from his vast experience, what he thinks about the readiness for us to harness the political commitment to implement the AfCFTA in this post-COVID era. I will be brief because of time, but I think he's a highly respected and experienced economist and manager with more than 25 years experience at the World Bank. He has also been instrumental on developing strategies, programs, and funding mechanisms for regional integration, as well as supporting the various areas of the operations of the bank in terms of their regional offices. Mr. Sherif, I want to thank you for being with us today. I think you have listened carefully to the statements made by your colleagues from the African Union. We know the African Development Bank is a strategic partner of the African Union, working in tandem on the key agenda issues. But what I'd like you to share with us today, in your role as the leader for the regional integration portfolio at the African Development Bank, what are the specific opportunities that that you are seeing for multilateral institutions like yourself, for investors, and for basically for Canadian investors who are looking at the continent with renewed interest at this time?
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you very much, delegates and participants, for having me. So to get to that question, let me begin first by positioning the discussion around the challenges that Africa is facing with regards to COVID-19 and the rebound it is going to need from COVID-19, which coincides with the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So the challenges that the continents are facing are very similar to what other continents are facing. So we have been lucky of the 55 countries in Africa, with the exceptions of 3 countries, to have pretty much avoided serious health outcomes from COVID-19, but the economic fallout has been substantial. We have 6 countries of our 55 regional member countries that depend on oil, for example, as their primary export. And of those 6 countries, 4 of them, oil exports represent 70% of their total revenues. So of course, for those countries, they are now in serious fiscal distress, and has been alluded to. Those countries are also now struggling to make debt payments to both multilaterals and bilaterals. And this is a particular challenge for those countries. Obviously, countries in Africa that are net oil importers or exporters of gold bullion are in a much better position as commodity markets play out. So commodity prices for key exports for the continent have also put certain parts of the continent in major distress. So for example, coffee beans and cocoa bean prices are at their lowest peg in over a decade. And this obviously impacts West Africa in particular. That represents about 60% of overall coffee and cocoa exports combined worldwide. Workers' remittances have fallen off, which several countries depend on as a primary source of foreign exchange. Regional trade borders are closed in the Southern African region, which obviously has a significant impact on the transfer of wealth across countries. This has come as a result of the concern over COVID being transmitted across borders. We are also looking at a situation where certain countries are struggling to make their wage payments for government employees, their pension payments, they're struggling with debt default. We are looking at problematic multilateral and bilateral debt payments requiring rescheduling. And probably worth noting also is state-owned enterprises across different countries are also struggling, some of them in national, some of them being national airlines. And the private sector obviously is also struggling with lockdowns across the board. It is in this context that to rebound from COVID-19, we obviously will be doing that simultaneously with the rollout of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And obviously for Africa, the AfCFTA is a crucial instrument that can bring all of our 55 member countries, member states of the African Union together to create a common market that will encompass over 1.2 billion people. Now, this also comes at a time where there is a very large growing middle class in the African continent, with combined GDP across our 55 countries of $3.4 trillion. However, having said that, of our 55 countries, resilience is a particular issue. We have 21 countries that depend on 3 primary exports, just 3. And when commodity exports, commodity markets adversely affect those exports, these countries go into serious economic decline. And this is why the African continent is projecting growth this year, given the COVID implications for the macroeconomy of the African continent, to be GDP growth to be minus 1.7 to 3.4%. We also have 8 of our countries in Africa, of our 55, that have GDP of less than $80 billion. Very, very small economies, some of them being island states. And this is why the African Continental Free Trade Agreement will bring to them the potential for growth across borders that they may not be able to generate on their own. But we also have 14 countries across the African continent where people live off less than $2 a day. And we have 36 countries where people live off less than $5 a day. Now, why is this substantially important? If you will all remember, labor demand is a derived demand, derived from the demand for goods and services. So if I have a country where the majority of the populace are living hand to mouth, their GDP per capita is about $2 a day, their consumption is next to none, their disposable income is next to none. If they don't demand goods and services because they don't have the disposable income, there is no signal to the private sector, domestic or foreign, to invest. And when you don't have the signal for the private sector to invest, you don't have a vehicle for creating employment, because labor is a derived demand, derived from the demand for goods and services. So this is why in roughly 11 of our 55 countries across the continent, the kind of investment that we see is foreign direct investment that's in the area of extractives. They are not there to make shoes or suits or ties for the general populace. They're there to extract the mineral wealth of the continent, to export it to where the wealth is, which is outside the African continent. So wealth creation is a huge challenge for the African continent. And this is why the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is absolutely, absolutely essential. Because unless we can find a vehicle for creating wealth, which is obviously completely dependent on creating regional value chains, on developing economies of scale in countries where you have comparative advantage, is also absolutely essential for the continent. We need a continent that will focus more on import substitution. I mean, it is unfortunate that the African continent imports roughly about $200 billion worth of foodstuffs from outside the African continent, when at least it can be fully self-sufficient in that area. And obviously, we are challenged with a continent where labor mobility has to be a priority. Property rights, the ability to own land across the continent, whether you are a citizen of one country, to be able to purchase land and to operate in that other country, has to be among the mainstays of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And this is obviously what this work is intending to do and is essential. So imagine, if you will, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement being the instrument that will create a common market, very much like NAFTA, the EU, and the wealth that's created in the Americas and in Europe as a result. And wealth creation is the principal objective, I believe, of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And this is incredibly important because household consumption is expected to grow in the African continent from where it is today to 2025, growing at a peg of 3.8%. And a number that isn't often quoted is by the time we get to 2025, household consumption by Africa, by African citizens, will be in excess of $2.1 trillion. Now, if this is not an economic opportunity for Canada or any country of the world, this is obviously something that everyone needs to focus on, because the African continent, when it comes to consumer spending, is growing at a peg virtually faster than anywhere else in the world. So from where we are today to where consumer spending is growing, this is actually a very good sign. Additionally, business spending, primarily to import things like capital goods, is going from 2.6 trillion, where it is currently in terms of business spending, and is expected to reach about 3.5 trillion by 2025. Another tremendous opportunity for anyone who wishes to import to the African continent. But those imports, as part of the vision of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, is also a vision where the continent is buying goods in bulk. It is getting the kind of economies of scale of importation that it needs to get the lowest price it can for the commodities that imports. What has to be behind us are the days of Egypt importing versus Sudan importing versus South Africa importing to a continent that is an economic bloc that is basically getting the best deals possible for the continent. Now, the other point that I wanted to speak to, when I said GDP per capita is less than $2 a day in a large number of African countries, how does this reconcile with the household consumption expenditures that are increasing at 3.8% per annum to getting to $2.1 trillion by 2025? The problem Africa has is about 80% of total wealth and consumer spending is concentrated in 11 countries, only in 11 countries of the 55. So when we talk about the $2.1 trillion of household consumption expected by 2025, this is going to be in 11 countries. So obviously, these are the growth poles of the African continent. And so obviously, when you see foreign direct investment, you're going to see foreign direct investment going to where consumption is, either by consumers or for business spending. Now, what we don't want is growth to be uneven. What we don't want is an African continent that is basically bipolar, or an African continent where the Gini coefficient of the African continent talks to distortions where you have countries that are extremely wealthy and you have countries that are extremely poor. And this is the direction a non-economic bloc Africa is going. So you're going to have a continent, if we keep going at this peg, of the haves and the have-nots. You'll have the wealthy and you'll have the poor, but you'll also have the countries that are in extreme poverty. And this is what, of course, working with the vision of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, the African Development Bank is trying to be impactful. The other statistic I'd like to speak to is that industry, African industry, is also taking off. So we expect manufacturing output to almost double from where it is now, which is about 500 million, to get to about 500 billion, to get to about 930 billion by 2025. So it is this industry that has to also operate at a level of economies of scale to be able to compete with the Chinas of the world. It has to enhance the resilience of our economies to make sure that countries do not depend on 1, 2, or 3 primary exports that when commodity markets go down, they are adversely affected. we have to develop wealth. We have to make sure that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement gets us to a level of wealth, gets GDP to grow in a way that trade promotes wealth, promotes comparative advantage, creates regional value chains, addresses the issue of economies of scale, addresses the issue of import substitution, especially for necessities like imported foodstuffs, creates jobs, and in essence, creates an Africa where GDP isn't just growing, GDP per capita is growing. So just to leave you with this final thought, over the past 8 years, the African continent's GDP has been growing at a peg of about 3.4%. Some countries that have done very well, that have now achieved middle income status, mixed status, have been basically year on year over the past half decade growing between 6 to 8%. But if we look at the African continent as a whole, we'll see GDP actually increasing, if you're looking at a line chart, in a very straight line fashion. But then when you look at GDP per capita in real terms, over the last 3 years, GDP per capita has been going down. So how is it that the African continent is getting wealthier, but on average, the African consumer is getting poorer, with the exception of 11 countries where household consumption is growing at over 4%. So it is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement that will allow us to get to a level of parity in growth across the continent, a level of wealth creation, and hopefully unlock the phenomenon where we don't just see GDP growth across the continent, we see GDP growth across the continent at a peg very similar to growth in GDP per capita. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is not just a concept, it's a vision. And hopefully it is a vision that will empower Africa to be a wealthier Africa, and an Africa that will see prosperity like it has never seen before. Thank you very much.